Hey everyone, let's delve tonight into the brutal, merciless, and utterly dreadful realm of genuine buccaneers. We often envision these romanticized figures, brandishing cutlasses under the moonlight, as Hollywood paints them as daring adventurers leading lives of freedom. In reality, a pirate's existence was among the most savage, demeaning, and fleeting one could possibly endure. Your physical well-being would be ravaged by illnesses, your mental state shattered by brutality, and society would relentlessly pursue you like a rabid beast until your unavoidable and grisly demise. So, before you get comfortable, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely appreciate the content I provide here. Also, drop a comment letting me know your location and the current time. It's truly captivating to see who tunes in from various corners of the globe. Now dim the lights. Perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You weren't given a choice to become a pirate. Pirates weren't born from aspirations of adventure or romantic ideals of oceanic liberty. They were forged by desperation, brutality, and the absolute absence of any other means of survival. Most pirates commenced their careers as coerced recruits, sailors forcibly taken from taverns, seized from city streets, or simply abducted from other vessels and compelled to serve aboard ships they never wished to step foot on. The press gangs that operated in the Caribbean and Atlantic coastal ports were merciless and highly efficient. They would sweep through waterfront districts like human dragnets, rounding up anyone who appeared capable of handling rigging or climbing masts. Age was largely irrelevant. Boys as young as 12 and men as old as 50 could find themselves hauled onto a ship, their former lives severed as cleanly as a cutlass's strike. You might have been an agricultural worker visiting port to sell produce, a carpenter seeking employment, or merely an inebriated person staggering home from a tavern. None of that mattered once the press gang identified you. The transformation from an unwilling sailor to a pirate wasn't an abrupt change marked by rituals and vows. It was a gradual erosion of human dignity that commenced the moment you were thrust below deck on your initial ship. Conditions aboard merchant and naval vessels were so deplorable that piracy often appeared to be an improvement rather than a descent into lawlessness. At the very least, pirates shared their spoils equitably, whereas legitimate sailors were defrauded, beaten, and worked to death for wages they might never receive. Your initial taste of life at sea was a brutal immersion in suffering. The ship's hold, where you would sleep, was a putrid cavern filled with unwashed bodies, decaying food, and human waste. The air was so dense with foul odors that breathing became a conscious effort. Men would vomit from seasickness, dysentery, and sheer disgust, contributing to the toxic, sloshing mixture that accumulated around your feet with every sway of the ship. Privacy was non-existent. You would eat, sleep, and relieve yourself in plain sight of dozens of other men, all of whom were becoming as desperate and dangerous as you were. The labor was grueling and incessant. 18-hour days were commonplace, spent hauling heavy lines, ascending treacherous rigging, and performing maintenance tasks that could easily be fatal with the slightest error. Your hands would blister and bleed within days, then harden into permanent calluses. Your back would ache from constant bending and lifting. Your feet would be cut and bruised from the rough deck planks. Sleep, when it occurred, was fitful and brief, just enough to sustain you for the next day's ordeal. The food was barely palatable and frequently infested with maggots. Hardtack biscuits were so teeming with weevils that sailors would tap them against the table to dislodge the insects before consumption. The meat was salted to the point of being nearly inedible, and the water was green with algae, tasting of the wooden barrels where it had been stored for months. Scurvy was an almost certainty. Your gums would bleed, your teeth would loosen, and your body would slowly begin to deteriorate from within. The officers treated you like cattle valuable enough to keep alive, but sufficiently expendable to beat senseless for the slightest transgression. The cat o' nine tails was a constant threat, its knotted leather strands capable of flaying the skin from a man's back in a mere dozen strokes. You would witness fellow sailors being flogged until they lost consciousness from pain, then revived with salt water poured onto their wounds. The screams would reverberate through the ship for hours afterward, serving as a stark reminder to everyone of the consequences for stepping out of line. Disease was an ever-present peril. Typhus, yellow fever, and dysentery swept through ships like epidemics, claiming lives faster than any battle ever could. You would awaken to discover the man sleeping beside you cold and rigid, his body already beginning to bloat in the tropical heat. The deceased were sewn into canvas shrouds and cast overboard with minimal ceremony. There was no time for proper mourning when survival demanded constant vigilance. Violence was not limited to official punishments. Desperate men in desperate circumstances turned on one another with alarming regularity. Brawls would erupt over meager food rations, accusations of theft, or simply the maddening stress of being confined together in hellish conditions. You would learn to sleep with one eye open and your knife within easy reach, because the man who smiled at you during the day might attempt to slit your throat at night for your meager possessions. Your initial encounter with actual pirates might occur during an assault on your own vessel. The black flag would appear on the horizon, and terror would seize the crew like a physical force. Yet, as the pirates swarmed aboard, cutlasses glinting and pistols discharging, you might observe something unexpected. They moved with purpose and discipline, not the chaotic bloodlust you had been led to anticipate. They were skilled professionals, and they offered you something your current superiors never had: a decision. The pirate captain would address the captured crew with surprising courtesy, explaining that any man who wished to join their company would be welcomed as an equal comrade. Those who preferred to remain with their current ship would be permitted to depart freely, though they might be divested of weapons and provisions. This stood in stark contrast to the press gangs that had initially enslaved you. Here was voluntary service, democratic decision-making, and the pledge of fair shares in any acquired loot. The choice to go on the account, as joining a pirate crew was known, was not made lightly. You understood you were crossing a boundary that could never be uncrossed. Once you took the pirate oath and signed the articles, you became an antagonist to all civilized nations. There would be no returning home, no reclaiming your former life, no clemency if you were captured. But as you surveyed your current circumstances, the brutal officers, the meager rations, the perpetual threat of disease and violence piracy began to appear less like damnation and more like liberation. Your metamorphosis from a coerced sailor to a pirate wasn't marked by any dramatic ceremony. You simply transitioned from one ship to another, leaving behind whatever remnants of your former identity remained. The clothes on your back, the calluses on your hands, and the scars on your body came with you. But everything else, your name, your past, your connections to the civilized world, was left drifting in the wake of your old ship. The pirate crew greeted you with a rough but watchful camaraderie. You were still an unknown quantity, a potential spy or coward who might betray them at the first sign of trouble. You would have to prove yourself through action, demonstrating your loyalty and courage in the crucible of conflict and hardship. The brotherhood of pirates was not bestowed freely. It had to be earned through blood, sweat, and shared suffering. Your new shipmates were a collection of the desperate, the violent, and the disenfranchised. Former sailors like yourself, escaped enslaved people seeking freedom, debtors fleeing their creditors, soldiers deserting from harsh armies, and criminals of every stripe. What united them was not a noble purpose or shared ideals, but mutual reliance and the awareness that they were all outcasts from the world they had formerly inhabited. The ship itself was your new home, prison, and fortress all in one. Unlike the merchant vessels or naval ships you might have known, a pirate ship was structured around the principle of survival through aggression. Every modification, every piece of equipment, every aspect of daily life was designed to render the ship more effective at hunting, capturing, and plundering other vessels. You were no longer merely a sailor. You were a predator, and the vast ocean was your hunting ground. Your education in piracy commenced immediately. You would learn to wield a cutlass and pistol, to move stealthily through rigging, to decipher the signs indicating a potential prize on the horizon. But more importantly, You would learn to think like a pirate, to view every ship as potential plunder, every port as a source of provisions and intelligence, every encounter as an opportunity for profit or a threat to be eradicated. The psychological transformation was perhaps the most profound change you would undergo. The moral constraints that had governed your previous existence, respect for property, obedience to authority, concern for innocent life, would gradually erode under the relentless pressure of survival. You would learn to rationalize violence as necessity, theft as fair redistribution, and murder as self-defense. The distinction between right and wrong would blur until it vanished entirely, replaced by the simpler calculus of survival and profit. Your former identity would fade like a half-remembered dream. The person you had been before, with family, friends, hopes, and aspirations, would seem like someone entirely different. A more unyielding and ruthless individual, molded by the harsh realities of piracy, would emerge in their stead. You would assume a new identity, new mannerisms, and new allegiances. This transformation would be so profound that even you might struggle to recall your former self before the black flag laid claim to you. Your new abode was a wooden prison, reeking of death, sickness, and human suffering. The pirate vessel, which initially seemed like a salvation compared to your previous ship, quickly revealed itself to be another form of torment, albeit with different torturers and marginally better provisions. The romanticized image of pirates freely navigating endless blue expanses was a cruel deception. You were confined to a cramped, foul-smelling, perilous environment alongside some of the most violent and unstable individuals alive. The ship itself was a labyrinth of dangers designed to kill the unprepared. Every surface was slippery with sea spray, tar, and various bodily excretions. The deck planks, worn smooth by countless footsteps, could send you careening into the rail or overboard with a single misstep. The rigging overhead formed a tangled web of ropes. Some were robust enough to support a man's weight, while others were rotted through and poised to snap at the most inopportune moment. You would learn to inspect every handhold and foothold, for one error could send you plummeting to the deck or into the shark-infested waters below. Beneath the deck was where the true horror resided. The gun deck, where the cannons were situated, was a low-ceilinged cavern that compelled even average-sized men to walk stooped. When the cannons were prepared for combat, there was barely sufficient space to maneuver between them. The odor was indescribable, a combination of gunpowder, decaying wood, bilge water, and the accumulated stench of men who hadn't bathed in months. The air was so dense you could almost taste it, and breathing became a conscious effort, leaving you gasping for clean air that never arrived. Your sleeping quarters consisted of a hammock strung between two cannons, if you were fortunate enough to have one. More frequently, you would sleep directly on the deck, using a coil of rope as a pillow and your coat as a blanket. Privacy was non-existent. You would sleep in close proximity to men who might attempt to rob or murder you in your slumber. The ship's incessant motion meant that sleep was restless at best, and you would awaken bruised from colliding with your neighbors or the ship's fixtures. The food was negligibly better than what you had endured on legitimate vessels, but that was hardly a commendation. The ship's cook, typically a man who had lost a limb in battle and was no longer fit for regular duties, would prepare meals in a galley that was little more than a firebox encircled by barrels of provisions. The staples included salt pork so tough you could use it as a weapon, hardtack biscuits that required soaking in rum to become edible, and a thin gruel made from whatever vegetables hadn't completely spoiled. Water was a perpetual concern. The barrels containing your drinking supply were breeding grounds for algae, bacteria, and various marine organisms. The water would turn verdant within weeks of departing port, and by the end of a protracted voyage, it would be thick enough to chew. Most pirates favored rum or beer, not for their alcoholic content, but because the fermentation process eradicated some of the harmful microorganisms that rendered water so perilous to drink. The rats were your constant companions, and in many respects, they enjoyed a superior existence to yours. They had unrestricted access to the ship, its food stores, and the ability to retreat to hidden spaces when danger loomed. You would awaken to discover them gnawing on your attire, your provisions, or occasionally your flesh if you slept too soundly. Some pirates even welcomed the rats. They served as a source of fresh meat when supplies dwindled, and their behavior could signal impending storms or other perils. Disease was the unseen adversary that claimed more pirates than all naval conflicts combined. Scurvy would cause your gums to rot and your teeth to loosen, making eating agonizing. Dysentery would leave you frail and dehydrated, constantly fouling yourself as your body expelled everything you attempted to consume. Typhus would surge through your body like fire, leaving you delirious and covered in the distinctive rash that marked you for death. Yellow fever would discolor your skin to the hue of old parchment and fill your vomit with blood. The ship's surgeon, if one was present, was usually a butcher who had acquired his skills on the battlefield rather than in any medical institution. His primary instruments were a bone saw, a bottle of rum for anesthesia, and a red-hot iron for cauterizing wounds. Surgery was performed on the gun deck by lantern light, with the patient restrained by his shipmates while the surgeon operated. The screams reverberated throughout the ship, and the mortality rate was so high that many men preferred to gamble with untreated wounds rather than submit to the surgeon's ministrations. The ship's odor was something that would haunt you for the remainder of your days. It was a complex blend of human waste, decaying food, stagnant water, gunpowder, tar, and death. The scent would permeate your clothing, your hair, your skin, until escape was impossible even in your dreams. Other pirates could identify you solely by your scent, and civilized individuals would recoil from you before you even uttered a word. Bathing was a luxury most pirates could not afford. Fresh water was too precious to squander on washing, and salt water would leave your skin raw and infected. Most men simply accepted their filth as an intrinsic aspect of the piratical condition, although some would disrobe during rainstorms to allow the fresh water to cleanse away the most egregious grime. Lice and fleas were ubiquitous companions, and you would spend idle moments plucking parasites from your clothing and hair. The ship's structure was in a constant state of decay under the relentless assault of saltwater, storms, and battle damage. Planks would loosen, permitting water to seep into the hold. The rigging would fray and snap, necessitating continuous repair and replacement. The sails would develop tears that had to be mended with whatever materials were available. Every pirate was expected to possess skills as a carpenter, sailmaker, and rope splicer, as the ship's survival depended on everyone's ability to maintain and repair the vessel. The bilge, the ship's lowest section where water accumulated, was a noxious concoction of seawater, urine, vomit, and decomposing organic matter. The stench emanating from the bilge was so putrid that it could render a man unconscious, and the water itself was hazardous to touch. Yet, someone had to descend into that infernal space regularly to operate the pumps that prevented the ship from sinking. This duty typically fell to the newest or least favored crew members, and many emerged from the bilge afflicted with infections that would plague them for months. The ship's unceasing motion was maddening for those unaccustomed to it. The deck would pitch and roll unpredictably, sending men and objects sliding across the planking. Eating, sleeping, and even maintaining a stationary position became arduous challenges demanding constant attention and adjustment. Seasickness was prevalent even among seasoned sailors, and the combination of nausea, dehydration, and the ship's foul air could leave men prostrate for days. Fire was perhaps the paramount fear aboard any wooden vessel, but especially a pirate ship laden with gunpowder and rum. A single spark in the wrong location could transform the entire ship into an inferno within minutes. The galley fire was meticulously tended and surrounded by sand and water barrels, but accidents were frequent. Many pirates bore burn scars from cooking fires, cannon blasts, or the flaming debris of enemy ships. The odor of scorched flesh was another element of the ship's distinctive aroma. The ship's armament provided both your protection and your greatest peril. The cannons were colossal iron beasts capable of crushing a man if they broke free from their restraints during a storm. The gunpowder was stored in the ship's magazine, a powder keg that could detonate at any moment if mishandled. Small arms cutlasses, pistols, and muskets were kept sharp and loaded, ready for immediate use, but also ready to cause accidental injury to the careless or unfortunate. Your personal space comprised whatever you could carry in a sea chest or bag. All your possessions had to fit into a container small enough to be rapidly moved if the ship was damaged or captured. Most pirates owned little more than a change of clothes, a weapon or two, and perhaps a few personal mementos from their former lives. Theft was common, and anything left unguarded would swiftly vanish into someone else's possession. The ship's hierarchy was enforced through violence and the persistent threat of it. The captain's decree was law, upheld by loyal crew members who would eliminate anyone who challenged his authority. The quartermaster controlled the distribution of food, water, and plunder, making him the second most powerful individual aboard. Beneath them were the various specialists: the navigator, the gunner, the carpenter, each with their own domain of expertise and responsibility. At the lowest rung were the common sailors, men like yourself, who performed the perilous, grimy work that kept the ship operational. The psychological burden of living in such conditions was immense. Men would succumb under the strain, becoming violent, paranoid, or simply catatonic. Suicide was not uncommon. Pirates would hurl themselves overboard rather than endure another day in the floating hell they had chosen as their home. Others would descend into madness, conversing with imaginary companions or believing they were still living their previous lives. The ship was a pressure cooker of human misery, and everyone aboard was slowly being cooked alive by the experience. Yet this floating hell was now your world, and you would have to learn not merely to survive within it, but to flourish. The vessel, which felt like a confinement, also served as your arsenal, your stronghold, and your sole hope of enduring in a world determined to see your demise. You would have to reconcile with the rodents, the foul odor, the illnesses, and the perpetual menace of death. For this wooden pandemonium was the only sanctuary left to you. The piratical company was neither a family nor a fraternity. Contrary to the allure of romantic narratives, it was a medley of desperate, aggressive individuals bound by mutual necessity, shared peril, and the understanding that treachery meant annihilation. The ties among buccaneers were forged in bloodshed and upheld through dread, and their practiced form of democracy more closely resembled structured chaos than any refined system of governance. The pirate regulations that governed your new existence were inscribed in blood and enforced with steel. These were not noble charters proclaiming entitlements and liberties. They were guidelines for survival that explicitly detailed how a collective of murderers and thieves could cooperate without self-destruction. Each crew possessed its unique variant, yet the fundamental tenets were universal: equitable distribution of spoils, democratic resolution for significant choices, and swift, brutal retribution for any who violated the codes. Your captain was not a sovereign or an autocrat, but rather a chieftain elected by the crew and subject to removal at any juncture. His command was absolute during engagements, when rapid judgments could signify the divergence between triumph and defeat. However, in times of peace, he was merely another voice in the democratic process, albeit one supported by proven proficiency and the allegiance of pivotal crew members. Numerous captains were ousted by their own men, occasionally with force, when they failed to provide the booty and prosperity the crew demanded. The quartermaster frequently wielded more influence than the captain in daily operations. He managed the allocation of provisions, water, and seized commodities, thereby becoming the arbiter of fairness and the recipient of every grievance. An adept quartermaster could preserve a crew through the direst adversities, whereas a corrupt or inept one could ignite a rebellion that would result in the demise of half the crew. The role necessitated not only administrative prowess, but also the physical fortitude to enforce unpopular decisions and the political acumen to navigate the intricate network of alliances and rivalries prevalent on every pirate vessel. The crew itself was segmented into diverse factions and cliques based on heritage, experience, and personal devotion. English buccaneers might unite against French ones, while seasoned members would disdain novices as potential encumbrances. These divisions could be leveraged by astute leaders, or could disintegrate a crew if not skillfully managed. You would need to judiciously traverse these social currents, cultivating alliances while evading adversaries, as your continued existence might hinge on possessing the appropriate allies when adversity arose. Violence served as the ultimate resolver of disagreements among pirates. While the articles stipulated democratic decision-making, disputes were often settled through duels, skirmishes, or straightforward assassination. An individual who felt aggrieved by a shipmate might challenge him to single combat, with the victor claiming whatever was in contention. These encounters were savage affairs, frequently fought with cutlasses or pistols, and they generally concluded with the death or permanent incapacitation of one of the combatants. The division of plunder was ostensibly meant to be equitable and democratic, yet in reality, it was a perpetual source of tension and strife. The articles might stipulate that each crew member received an identical share, but there were consistently disagreements about what constituted a just apportionment. Valuable items such as jewels or superior armaments might be claimed by individuals prior to the general distribution, leading to accusations of larceny and demands for recompense. The process of distributing captured goods could span several days and often culminated in aggression as men contended over their perceived rightful portion. Trust was a scarce and valuable commodity among pirates. Every individual understood that his shipmates were malefactors and killers who had renounced their former allegiances to join the crew. The awareness that everyone aboard was capable of murder and perfidy engendered an atmosphere of unceasing suspicion and paranoia. You would learn to sleep lightly, to never turn your back on a potential adversary, and to always be prepared for the blade that might appear from any direction. The code of honor purportedly governing pirate conduct was more fabrication than fact. While pirates might exhibit clemency toward those who capitulated without a fight, they were equally prone to tormenting and executing captives for amusement or intelligence. The romantic notion of honorable thieves who exclusively pilfered from the affluent was ludicrous. Pirates would rob anyone they could overpower, from affluent merchants to impoverished fishermen. The sole honor among brigands was the temporary coalition essential for mutual preservation. Loyalty among pirates was conditional and transient. A man might be your trusted companion one moment and your deadly foe the next, depending on shifts in circumstances. Crews would fracture over disagreements regarding targets, strategies, or the partition of spoils. Former shipmates would pursue one another across the Caribbean, seeking vengeance for genuine or imagined offenses. The bonds of pirate camaraderie were sufficiently robust to confront external adversaries, yet fragile enough to shatter under internal strain. The initiation of new crew members was frequently a brutal ordeal designed to test their devotion and dismantle their previous loyalties. You might be compelled to partake in acts of aggression against innocent victims to demonstrate that you had truly abandoned your former moral convictions. The crew would meticulously observe your responses, searching for indicators of frailty or hesitation that might suggest you still clung to civilized principles. Those who failed these trials might find themselves marooned on a solitary island or simply cast overboard. The ship's discipline was maintained through a blend of democratic participation and authoritative enforcement. While principal decisions were determined by vote, daily operations were overseen by the officers who possessed the authority to penalize infractions with flogging, confinement, or reduction of rations. The punishments were often harsh and invariably public, devised to serve as deterrents to the rest of the crew. An individual who pilfered from his shipmates might lose a hand, while one who displayed cowardice in combat might be marooned or executed. The social hierarchy aboard a pirate vessel was dynamic yet tangible. Experienced combatants and proficient mariners commanded greater deference than newcomers, or those with specialized but non-combat proficiencies. A man's reputation for bravery, cunning, and triumph in battle would dictate his standing within the crew and his sway in decision-making. Those at the bottom of the hierarchy, the timid, the inept, and the unfortunate, were regarded as expendable and might be sacrificed without hesitation if conditions necessitated it. The crew's rapport with their vessel was almost mystical. The ship was not merely conveyance or armament, it was their dwelling, their bastion, and their means of endurance. Every man intimately understood the ship's capabilities and limitations, and they would fight to the death to safeguard it. The loss of their ship signified death or capture for the entire crew. Thus, the maintenance and protection of the vessel was everyone's duty. This shared reliance forged one of the few genuine connections among the crew members. Women were generally prohibited aboard pirate ships, not due to chivalry, but because their presence was perceived as a source of discord and distraction. The few women who did join pirate crews, such as Anne Bonny and Mary Read, had to validate themselves through extraordinary courage and ability. They were often more ferocious and merciless than their male counterparts, perhaps because they had to overcome additional prejudice and suspicion. The presence of women could disrupt the delicate balance of power and loyalty that sustained a crew. The crew's interaction with the external world was characterized by mutual animosity. Pirates were adversaries of all civilized nations, relentlessly pursued by naval forces and colonial authorities wherever they ventured. This shared status as outlaws fostered a bond among crew members, but it also implied that they could never truly trust anyone beyond their immediate circle. Every encounter with strangers was potentially lethal, and paranoia was a survival trait rather than a character flaw. The democratic principles that pirates purported to uphold were often undermined by the realities of life at sea. While every individual might theoretically possess a vote, in practice, the most violent and charismatic individuals dominated decision-making. The crew might vote to assault a particular target, but the actual tactics would be determined by those with the most combat experience. Democracy among pirates more closely resembled mob rule than any civilized form of government. The Brotherhood of Pirates was ultimately a transient alliance of convenience rather than a genuine fraternal bond. Men joined pirate crews for personal gain and survival, not out of allegiance to their shipmates or conviction in pirate ideals. When circumstances shifted, when plunder became scarce, when naval pressure escalated, or when superior opportunities arose, the Brotherhood would dissolve as rapidly as it had materialized. The ties that appeared so potent in combat would prove brittle when challenged by hardship or enticement. Your position within this brotherhood was acquired through aggression and maintained through incessant vigilance. You would have to prove your worth in battle, demonstrate your loyalty through shared hardship, and exhibit your commitment by participating in the crew's illicit activities. The Brotherhood would safeguard you as long as you remained advantageous, but it would abandon or eliminate you the instant you became a liability. It was a severe form of comradeship, yet it constituted the sole remaining familial bond in a world that sought your demise. The instant a potential prize was sighted on the horizon, the entire vessel would transform from a dilapidated floating dwelling into a formidable predatory war machine. The mundane routine of daily upkeep and casual conversation would erupt into frantic activity as every man prepared for the deadly contest of predator and quarry. This was your reason for being the chance to seize by force what others had acquired through honest toil, to demonstrate your valor in conflict, and to claim your portion of whatever riches could be extracted from your victims. The initial sighting would originate from the lookout positioned high in the crow's nest. A man endowed with keen eyesight and the vocal power to project his findings above the wind and waves. "Sail ho!" would echo across the deck, followed by specifics regarding the stranger's dimensions, trajectory, and apparent nationality. The crew would abandon their current tasks, straining their eyes towards the horizon, endeavoring to glimpse what might be their next target or their next adversary. The captain and his officers would scrutinize the distant vessel through their spyglasses, attempting to ascertain whether pursuit was warranted. A heavily armed warship would be avoided unless the crew harbored a particularly suicidal inclination, whereas a solitary merchant vessel would be stalked like a wounded deer. The decision to initiate pursuit was not made lightly. It would commit the crew to hours or even days of chasing with no assurance of success and the constant peril that their prey might prove more formidable than assumed. Once the decision to pursue was finalized, the ship would stir with purposeful activity. The sails would be adjusted to capture every available breath of wind. The hull would be divested of superfluous weight, and the crew would embark on the protracted process of readying for combat. Weapons would be honed and loaded. Boarding apparatus would be prepared, and the ship's surgeon would establish his makeshift operating theater in anticipation of the wounded who would soon require his ministrations. The chase itself was a trial of seamanship, endurance, and fortitude. Your vessel needed to be swifter than your quarry, but speed alone was insufficient. You had to outmaneuver them, preempt their changes in course, and progressively close the distance without alerting them to your aggressive intentions. A proficient pirate ship could maintain the illusion of being a harmless merchant vessel until the very last moment, when the black flag would be hoisted, and the true nature of the encounter would be unveiled. The crew's temperament during a chase was a melange of exhilaration, apprehension, and bloodthirsty anticipation. Men would jest and boast about their intended actions towards their victims, yet beneath the bravado lay the awareness that they might be sailing towards their own demise. Every chase was a gamble, the potential reward of captured treasure juxtaposed against the very real possibility of being killed, injured, or captured by their intended prey. As the distance diminished, the tension would become almost insufferable. The crew would observe their quarry for indicators of recognition or alarm. A sudden alteration in course, the appearance of additional sails, or the ominous sight of gunports opening along the stranger's hull. A merchant ship that abruptly revealed itself to be a disguised warship could transform hunters into hunted within minutes. Many pirate crews had learned this painful lesson too late to safeguard themselves. The final approach necessitated impeccable timing and coordination. The pirate ship would draw to within hailing distance, still flying false colors and sustaining the pretense of peaceful intentions. The captain would issue cordial greetings while his crew prepared for violence, their weapons concealed but poised. The moment of truth would arrive when the black flag was raised, and the demand for surrender was bellowed across the water. The response of the intended victim would dictate the subsequent events. A prudent merchant captain might surrender immediately, recognizing that resistance would only worsen his predicament. However, some would opt to resist, driven by courage, desperation, or a simple miscalculation of their odds. The pirate crew would observe their quarry's reaction with predatory intensity, ready to respond to either submission or defiance with overwhelming force. If the victim chose to resist, the true hunt would commence. Cannon fire would reverberate across the water as both ships maneuvered for strategic advantage. The pirates would endeavor to disable their prey's rigging or steering, rendering escape impossible while preserving the valuable cargo. The defenders would fight for their lives, aware that surrender might still lead to death, and that their sole hope lay in repelling their attackers or reaching the sanctuary of a friendly port. The crew's behavior during the chase reflected the authentic character of pirates. Some men would become almost feral with excitement, their eyes gleaming with the prospect of violence and plunder. Others would grow quiet and focused, inspecting their weapons and mentally bracing for the brutal task ahead. A few might exhibit signs of fear or reluctance, earning the disdain of their more bloodthirsty shipmates and branding themselves as potential cowards who could not be relied upon in a conflict. The ship itself would undergo a transformation during the chase, with every available space cleared for action. The deck would be sanded to offer superior footing and to absorb the blood that would soon be shed. Boarding nets would be rigged to impede enemy sailors from clambering aboard, while grappling hooks and boarding planks would be readied for the pirates' own assault. The ship would become a weapon, every fitting and fixture engineered to facilitate the capture and plundering of other vessels. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical chase was as crucial as seamanship and firepower. Pirates cultivated reputations for extreme violence and barbarity, knowing that fear could be more efficacious than cannonballs in compelling a surrender. Tales of torture, murder, and atrocity would disseminate throughout the maritime community, rendering the sight of a pirate flag a source of terror capable of paralyzing resistance before it even began. The crew's solidarity during a chase was both their greatest asset and their gravest vulnerability. When concentrated on a common adversary, the pirates could cooperate with lethal efficiency, their individual skills converging into a formidable fighting force. Yet, the same men who collaborated perfectly during the hunt might turn on each other once the immediate danger had passed, squabbling over the division of spoils or nursing resentments that had festered during the heat of battle. The hunt was also a crucible for leadership, as the captain and his officers had to make instantaneous decisions that could signify the difference between triumph and catastrophe. A captain who displayed hesitation or poor judgment during a chase might find his authority challenged by ambitious subordinates who believed they could perform better. The crew's confidence in their leaders was directly correlated with their success in securing prizes, and a series of failures could culminate in mutiny and the violent overthrow of the ship's command structure. The environmental elements that influenced the chase wind, weather, currents, and visibility were beyond anyone's control, yet could dictate the outcome of the confrontation. A sudden squall might enable a merchant ship to escape, while a dead calm might trap both predator and prey in a deadly deadlock. Pirates had to be expert seamen as well as fighters, capable of interpreting the signs of shifting weather and utilizing natural conditions to their advantage. The moment when the black flag was finally unfurled marked the point of no return for both pirates and their victims. It was a declaration of war, a promise of violence, and a commitment to see the encounter through to its bloody conclusion. There could be no retreat, no negotiation, no mercy, only the brutal arithmetic of predator and prey that would determine who lived, who died, and who would sail away with the spoils of victory. When the moment for violence ultimately arrived, all romantic notions of swashbuckling adventure would dissipate in the smoke and screaming chaos of actual combat. Battle at sea was not a graceful dance of skilled swordsmen. It was a brutal, terrifying melee where men died in agony, and the survivors were often maimed for life. The taste of gunpowder, blood, and fear would fill your mouth as you fought for your life against adversaries who were just as desperate and vicious as you had become. The initial exchange of cannon fire would shatter the morning air with a thunder that could be heard for miles. The massive iron balls would crash into wooden hulls with devastating impact, sending splinters flying like lethal arrows and transforming proud ships into floating wreckage within minutes. The sound was indescribable. A combination of explosion, splintering wood, and human screaming that would reverberate in your ears long after the battle had concluded. Your ship would tremble and groan under the assault of enemy fire, the deck planking buckling and splitting as cannonballs tore through the hull. Men would be cut down by flying debris, their bodies broken and bleeding as they writhed in agony amidst the shattered remnants of their floating sanctuary. The fortunate ones would die swiftly, while others would linger in torment, crying out for assistance that might never come. As the battle raged around them, the smoke from the cannons would create a fog of war that rendered visibility impossible beyond a few yards in any direction. You would fight blindly, swinging your cutlass at shadows and forms that might be enemies or might be your own shipmates. The acrid scent of gunpowder would sear your nostrils and throat, while the taste of sulfur would coat your tongue like the very breath of hell. As the ships closed for boarding, the true carnage would commence. Grappling hooks would slice through the atmosphere, their metallic claws sinking firmly into the enemy's rigging and hull planks. The two vessels would be drawn together, entwined like lovers in a lethal embrace. Their flanks would grind against each other as men braced themselves to leap across the narrow chasm, separating existence from demise. The instant the ships made contact served as the catalyst for the most savage confrontation imaginable. The boarding party would surge across the gap, cutlasses gleaming and pistols blazing, their countenances contorted into expressions of fury and bloodlust. These were not the refined, precise sword duels of romantic literature. They were desperate melees where men hacked and stabbed each other with any available weapon. Cutlasses would clang against boarding axes, pistol butts would shatter skulls, and men would bite and claw at each other like untamed beasts. Your initial taste of close-quarters combat would reveal your own capacity for brutality. The societal restraints that had governed your previous existence would shed away like discarded garments as you battled for survival. You'd uncover muscles you never knew you possessed, reflexes seemingly originating from some primal part of your brain, and a willingness to inflict pain and death that would have appalled your former self. The deck would become slick with blood, rendering footing precarious and transforming each step into a potential tumble that could leave you vulnerable to an adversary's blade. Men would stumble and slide in the gore of their fallen comrades, their boots unable to find purchase on the crimson-stained planking. The scent of blood would intermingle with gunpowder smoke and human waste as men lost control of their bodily functions in the extremity of terror and agony. The sounds of battle would assail your ears from every direction. The clang of steel against steel, the sharp crack of pistol shots, the shrieks of the injured and dying, and the guttural roars of men consumed by the frenzy of combat. Some men would fight in silence, their faces grim with resolve, while others would howl like demons as they carved their path through enemy ranks. The cacophony would be so intense that you'd have to rely on hand signals and gestures to communicate with your shipmates. The wounded would crawl across the deck seeking refuge or assistance, leaving trails of blood in their wake. Some would plead for mercy, while others would attempt to drag themselves to safety or continue fighting even with mortal injuries. You'd learn to step over or around the fallen without breaking stride, because pausing to aid an injured man might mean joining him in death. Compassion was a luxury few could afford in the heat of battle. The ship's surgeon would toil frenetically in his makeshift operating theater, amputating shattered limbs and striving to staunch arterial bleeding with whatever instruments and provisions he had at hand. The screams emanating from the surgery area would add another layer of horror to the battle's soundtrack, as men realized that survival might entail living the remainder of their lives as cripples. Many would prefer death to the prospect of begging for scraps in some waterfront tavern, their fighting days terminated by a surgeon's saw. The psychological reverberations of your initial genuine battle would be as devastating as any physical injury. The sight of men with whom you had shared meals lying dead in pools of their own blood would haunt your dreams for years to come. The realization that you had taken other human lives, men who might have had families, hopes, and aspirations just like your own, would erode whatever remained of your conscience like acid on metal. Some men would succumb under the pressure of combat, their minds fracturing like overstressed rope. They might freeze in place, unable to move or fight, making them effortless targets for enemy weapons. Others might descend into a berserker rage, attacking both friend and foe in a paroxysm of violence that would only cease when they were killed or rendered unconscious. The fragile boundary between bravery and madness would become terrifyingly apparent as you witnessed powerful men reduced to incoherent wrecks by the horrors of battle. The ebb and flow of combat would mirror the ocean itself, with first one side and then the other gaining the upper hand. A single well-aimed pistol shot could dispatch a ship's captain and demoralize his entire crew, while the arrival of unexpected reinforcements could transmute certain defeat into glorious triumph. You'd become adept at interpreting the indicators of a battle's progression, the sound of fighting, the movement of men, the shouts of victory or despair that would reveal whether your side was prevailing or faltering. The moment when resistance finally crumbled would be almost anticlimactic following the ferocity of combat. The surviving adversaries would cast down their weapons and plead for quarter, their faces pale with shock and vanquishment. Some pirates would honor the surrender, while others would persist in killing, gripped by battle madness. The distinction between victory and massacre was often determined by the capricious whims of individual fighters, rather than any coherent strategy or moral code. The aftermath of battle would expose the genuine cost of your violent profession. The deck would be strewn with bodies, both comrade and foe, their blood commingling in the scuppers that drained the ship's waste into the sea. The wounded would moan and cry for assistance, while the survivors would stand in stunned silence, attempting to process what they had just endured. The ship itself would bear the scars of combat, shattered railings, tattered sails, and cannon holes that would necessitate immediate repair to avert sinking. Your own response to surviving your first true battle would be intricate and contradictory. Relief at being alive would intertwine with horror at what you had witnessed and participated in. Pride in your courage would contend with repulsion at your own capacity for violence. The adrenaline that had propelled you through the fighting would dissipate, leaving you trembling and nauseous as the full impact of the experience took hold. You'd recognize that you had crossed another threshold, that the person who had entered battle was not the same as the one who had survived it. The flavor of battle would linger in your mouth long after the fighting had ceased. The metallic tang of blood, the acrid residue of gunpowder, and the bitter taste of fear and adrenaline. It was a flavor you'd never forget, one that would return to haunt you in quiet moments for the remainder of your life. You had tasted violence and discovered that you could not only endure it, but excel at it. A realization that would transform you in ways you couldn't yet comprehend. Victory and battle brought their own distinct form of torment, as the crew descended upon their captured prize like vultures on a cadaver. The systematic pillaging that ensued after every successful assault unveiled the true character of pirate nature. These were not the noble brigands of legend, but desperate individuals driven by avarice, cruelty, and the understanding that their next meal might depend on what they could extort from their victims. The paramount concern was always securing the seized vessel and its crew. The surviving defenders would be gathered together under guard, their weapons confiscated, and their hands bound to thwart any attempt at resistance or sabotage. The pirates would move through the ship methodically, ransacking every cabin, every storage compartment, every conceivable hiding place where valuables might be concealed. Nothing was too minor or insignificant to escape their scrutiny. Buttons, buckles, and personal trinkets would all be stripped from the prisoners and added to the accumulating mound of plunder. The ship's cargo hold would be thoroughly ransacked with the meticulousness of professional thieves. Barrels would be breached, crates would be splintered, and bales of goods would be torn open to expose their contents. The pirates would sort through everything with seasoned eyes, separating the valuable from the worthless with the efficiency of men who had performed this task numerous times before. Sugar, tobacco, silk, spices, and precious metals would be carefully inventoried, while lesser valuable items might be discarded or obliterated in the frenzy of looting. The treatment of prisoners during the looting process exposed the profound depths of pirate cruelty. Captured officers and passengers would be tormented to reveal the location of hidden valuables, their screams echoing through the ship as pirates applied hot irons, knives, and other instruments of persuasion to extract information. Female passengers faced particular horrors as pirates viewed them as both sources of ransom money and objects for their own perverse gratification. The code of honor that supposedly governed pirate conduct was swiftly disregarded when profit could be reaped from human suffering. The distribution of plunder was intended to adhere to the democratic principles outlined in the ship's articles, but in practice, it often became a source of violent contention among the crew. The most valuable items would be claimed by the captain and his officers, while the common sailors would contend over the remnants. Arguments would erupt over the equitable value of different goods, with men brandishing knives at each other over a handful of silver coins or a bolt of fine fabric. The quartermaster would endeavor to maintain order, but his authority was frequently challenged by crew members who felt they were being defrauded of their rightful share. The quest for hidden treasure would consume hours or even days as pirates tore apart the captured ship, searching for secret compartments and concealed valuables. They would rip up deck planking, demolish bulkheads, and even torture crew members to ascertain the location of the ship's strongbox or the captain's private hoard. The systematic destruction of the vessel was both practical and psychological. It served to uncover hidden wealth while simultaneously demonstrating the pirates' complete dominance over their victims. Personal effects of the captured crew and passengers would be distributed among the pirates like party favors. Garments, adornments, weaponry, and personal belongings would be claimed by the swiftest, prompting clashes and disputes over particularly coveted items. A fine coat or a meticulously crafted sword could hold more significance than its monetary value to a buccaneer who had been clad in rags and wielding a rusty cutlass. The psychological toll on victims, witnessing their most cherished possessions divided among their captors, frequently rivaled the devastation of physical torment. The fate of the captured vessel itself hinged on its condition and utility to the pirates. A swift, well-armed ship might be integrated into the pirate fleet, whereas a sluggish or damaged one could be stripped of all valuables and subsequently torched or scuttled. This decision would be collectively made by the crew, with debates regarding the ship's potential worth often culminating in fiery arguments and occasionally violence. A vessel perceived as a valuable prize by one pirate might be deemed a worthless hulk by another, not warranting the effort of upkeep. The treatment of apprehended crew members varied according to their proficiencies and the pirates' immediate requirements. Experienced sailors, carpenters, surgeons, and navigators might be coerced into service with the pirate crew, regardless of their willingness. Those who resisted cooperation could face torture, marooning, or simply being cast overboard. The fortunate ones would be released in a small boat with minimal provisions, left to navigate their way to safety or perish in the attempt. The unfortunate became victims of pirate sadism, tormented and slain for amusement or as a deterrent to others. The psychological ramifications of successful piracy on the crew were intricate and often ruinous. The exhilaration of victory and the acquisition of riches would induce a fleeting euphoria that masked the inherent brutality of their recent actions. Men would commemorate their triumph with imbibing, gambling, and aggression, utilizing alcohol and belligerence to suppress any feelings of culpability or remorse for their deeds. The awareness that they had just devastated other people's lives for their own gain would erode any remaining vestiges of their humanity. The immediate aftermath of a triumphant raid frequently witnessed an eruption of violence within the pirate crew itself. The strain of combat, coupled with the thrill of victory and the influence of confiscated alcohol, would precipitate altercations, duels, and occasionally fatalities among the pirates. Ancient grievances would resurface. Fresh conflicts would emerge over the distribution of loot, and the temporary unity forged in battle would dissolve into factional violence that could shatter the crew. The plundered goods necessitated transportation back to the pirate ship and proper storage, a process demanding meticulous planning and execution. Valuable items would be encased in waterproof containers to shield them from saltwater spray and turbulent seas. Perishable commodities required swift consumption or preservation for later use. The logistics of conveying substantial quantities of pilfered merchandise between vessels amidst rough seas was hazardous work that claimed its own share of casualties. The elimination of evidence constituted another critical aspect of successful piracy. Any documents that might identify the captured ship or its cargo would be obliterated to prevent authorities from tracing the stolen goods. The ship's log, passenger manifests, and cargo records would be jettisoned or incinerated. Distinctive items recognizable by their original owners would be altered or destroyed. The pirates would strive to eradicate any trace of their transgression that could later be used against them. The celebration following a prosperous raid was often as violent and destructive as the battle itself. Pirates would drink themselves unconscious, quarrel over perceived slights, and engage in acts of cruelty and debauchery that would shock even hardened criminals. The transient wealth and the release of tension after a successful attack would lead to orgies of violence and excess that could persist for days. Many pirates would awaken from these revelries to discover they had gambled away their share of the spoil or been pilfered by their own shipmates. The long-term repercussions of successful piracy were frequently overlooked in the immediate euphoria of triumph. Each successful assault rendered the crew more sought after by authorities, increased the bounty on their heads, and diminished the number of safe harbors where they could seek refuge. The wealth they had amassed would transform them into targets for other pirates, while their escalating reputation would make it more challenging to find victims who wouldn't fight to the death rather than surrender. Success in piracy often served as the initial step toward eventual ruin. The moral decay that accompanied successful piracy was gradual, yet inexorable. Each triumphant attack made the subsequent one easier to rationalize. Every act of cruelty made the next seem less significant, and each victim made it simpler to perceive other human beings as mere sources of profit. The fruits of violence carried a hidden cost: the progressive erosion of whatever humanity the pirates had retained, until they became the monsters their victims saw when they regarded them with terror-filled eyes. When your vessel finally limped into one of the few ports that would welcome pirates, you would discover that these havens of lawlessness were every bit as perilous and corrupt as the ships that frequented them. Places like Port Royal, Nassau, and Tortuga were not romantic pirate paradises. They were festering sores on the face of civilization, where violence, disease, and depravity thrived like tropical weeds in the Caribbean sun. Port Royal, prior to the earthquake of 1692 that sent most of it sliding into the sea, was perhaps the most infamous of these pirate strongholds. Constructed on a narrow strip of land protruding into Kingston Harbor, it was a labyrinth of taverns, brothels, and gambling dens where pirates could dissipate their ill-gotten gains as rapidly as they had acquired them. The thoroughfares were unpaved and frequently ankle-deep in mud, human waste, and the detritus of a society that had forsaken all pretense of civilization. The aroma of these ports would assault your senses long before you could glimpse the shore. a nauseating concoction of decaying fish, human effluent stagnant water, and the cloying stench of decomposing bodies often left where they fell. The tropical heat would intensify every odor, creating a miasma of corruption that seemed to cling to your garments and epidermis like a tangible presence. Even hardened pirates, accustomed to the foul air of their ships, would occasionally retch when the wind carried the full bouquet of port life across the water. The populace of these ports was an assemblage of the desperate, the violent, and the utterly lost. Pirates constituted only a fraction of the inhabitants. They were joined by escaped slaves, army deserters, debtors fleeing their creditors, criminals of every description, and the human wreckage that washed up on these shores like driftwood after a tempest. Women were scarce and frequently treated as commodities to be bought, sold, or contended over. Children, when they existed, grew up feral and vicious, learning to pilfer and take lives before they learned to read or write. The taverns lining the waterfront resembled armed encampments more than venues of hospitality. Each establishment was controlled by a distinct faction or gang, and entering the wrong one could mean instant death for an unwary pirate. The ale and rum served in these places were often watered down or adulterated with substances that could blind or poison the unsuspecting drinker. Fights would erupt over imagined slights, unpaid debts, or simple drunken aggression, and the floors would be stained with blood that was never properly cleansed. Gambling was the primary diversion in these ports, but the games were rigged, and the stakes often involved life and death. Pirates would squander their shares of plunder in a single night of cards or dice, then resort to violence to reclaim their losses. Cheating was commonplace and anticipated, but being exposed meant confronting the wrath of armed men who had nothing left to lose. The gambling dens were strewn with the bodies of those who had overextended their luck or trusted the wrong individuals. The brothels were perhaps the most debased establishments in ports that specialized in degradation. The women who worked in them were often slaves, captives, or simply desperate souls with no other means of survival. Disease was rampant. Syphilis, gonorrhea, and other sexually transmitted infections spread through the population like wildfire. Many pirates would emerge from these establishments, not only poorer, but infected with ailments that would slowly claim their lives over the ensuing months or years. Medical care in these ports was rudimentary and often more perilous than the injuries or illnesses it was intended to treat. The few doctors were typically drunkards, charlatans, or butchers who had been ostracized from civilized society for their incompetence or cruelty. Surgery was performed without anesthesia in squalid conditions, and the mortality rate was so high that many pirates preferred to tend to their own wounds rather than submit to professional medical attention. The legal framework in pirate ports was founded on violence and personal vengeance rather than any coherent code of justice. Disputes were resolved through duels, brawls, or simple assassination. The strongest and most ruthless individuals would emerge as informal leaders, but their authority was perpetually temporary and subject to challenge by anyone brave or foolish enough to attempt it. Murder was so prevalent that bodies would be left in the streets for days before anyone bothered to dispose of them. The economy of these ports was entirely reliant on the proceeds of piracy and other illicit activities. Merchants who engaged with pirates were frequently as corrupt and brutal as their clientele, selling overpriced goods and services to individuals compelled to pay whatever was demanded. Prices for everything from provisions to weaponry were inflated significantly beyond their true value, as traders exploited the pirates' ephemeral affluence and urgent necessities. The spiritual life in these harbors was either absent or thoroughly debased. The scarce churches that existed often served as venues for criminal plots or as refugees for those fleeing immediate aggression. Clergy, when discoverable, were typically as corrupt as their congregants, prioritizing profit over salvation. Many pirates had relinquished any semblance of religious belief, viewing their circumstances as evidence that God either did not exist or had abandoned them to their destiny. The social structure in pirate ports was unstable and violent, predicated on current wealth, combat prowess, and the allegiance of armed followers. A successful pirate captain might be revered like royalty one day and assassinated in an alley the next if his fortune shifted. Reputation was paramount, but it could be lost as swiftly as it was acquired. The sole constant was flux, as fortunes ascended and descended with the tides and the triumph or failure of piratical expeditions. The transient nature of pirate wealth was nowhere more apparent than in these ports. Men who had risked their lives to seize valuable prizes would dissipate their shares within days or weeks, spending money on alcohol, gambling, and women with the reckless abandon of those who recognized they might not survive to see another payday. The philosophy of a brief and merry life was realized to its logical extreme in the taverns and brothels of these lawless sanctuaries. The persistent threat of assault by naval forces or rival pirate factions kept these ports in a state of continuous tension. Lookouts would be stationed to monitor for approaching vessels, and the entire populace would be poised to flee or fight at a moment's notice. The fortifications protecting these ports were often rudimentary but effective, manned by desperate individuals who understood that capture signified death. The awareness that their refuge could be obliterated at any moment introduced another layer of desperation to an already volatile situation. The cultural existence of pirate ports was crude and violent, reflecting the character of their inhabitants. Entertainment predominantly comprised drinking, gambling, fighting, and sexual exploitation. Music, when present, typically consisted of bawdy songs celebrating aggression and vulgarity. Art was restricted to coarse graffiti and the occasional tattoo. Literature was non-existent among a populace that was largely unlettered and uninterested in intellectual pursuits. The environmental conditions in these ports were dreadful, even by the standards of the era. Sanitation was non-existent, with human waste and refuse merely cast into the streets or the harbor. Disease-carrying insects flourished in the tropical climate, spreading malaria, yellow fever, and other lethal illnesses throughout the population. The water supply was often contaminated, compelling inhabitants to rely on alcohol for hydration, which only exacerbated the general level of violence and disorder. The children who matured in these ports, if they survived at all, were molded by the aggression and corruption that enveloped them. They acquired skills in theft, combat, and killing as naturally as other children learned to read and write. Many would emulate their parents in piracy or other illicit activities, perpetuating the cycle of violence and degradation that characterized these communities. The few who managed to escape frequently carried the psychological scars of their upbringing for the remainder of their lives. The ports of the damned served as both a refuge and a snare for the pirates who utilized them. They offered temporary security from naval pursuit and a place to expend their illicit gains. However, they also consumed that wealth with alarming rapidity and exposed pirates to fresh perils from their own kind. Many pirates would arrive at these ports affluent and self-assured, only to depart impoverished, ailing, and demoralized. The ports that promised emancipation and enjoyment delivered only corruption and despair, adding another dimension of suffering to lives already replete with hardship and aggression. The money that flowed through pirate hands like water through a sieve was both the impetus for their transgressions and the tool of their undoing. The wealth that pirates risked their lives to procure was spent with a reckless abandon that mirrored their awareness that death was always just one skirmish away. The economic reality of pirate life was a boom and bust cycle that left most pirates poorer than the honest sailors they had once been. A successful raid might net each crew member more money than a legitimate sailor could earn in several years. But this windfall would typically be squandered within days or weeks of reaching port. Pirates had no concept of saving or investment. Their philosophy was to spend everything immediately because tomorrow they might be dead, captured, or simply unlucky enough to find themselves on the losing side of a battle. This attitude created a feast or famine existence that was as psychologically damaging as it was financially ruinous. The division of plunder among the crew was intended to adhere to the democratic principles outlined in the ship's articles, but in practice it was often a source of violent conflict. The captain might receive 2 or 3 shares, the quartermaster and other officers 1.5 shares, and the common sailors 1 share each. But disputes would emerge over the valuation of different goods, the definition of what constituted a fair share, and the handling of particularly valuable items like jewelry or precious metals. The actual process of dividing captured wealth was often chaotic and violent. Goods would be spread out on the deck or beach, and crew members would argue over every item. Fights would erupt over who had the right to claim particular pieces, and men would sometimes kill each other over relatively small amounts of money. The quartermaster would attempt to maintain order, but his authority was often challenged by crew members who felt they were being defrauded. The types of wealth that pirates acquired varied considerably depending on their targets and fortune. Spanish treasure ships might yield silver coins, gold bars, and precious gems, while merchant vessels would more commonly carry trade goods like sugar, tobacco, silk, or spices. These commodities had to be converted into cash through sales to corrupt merchants in pirate ports, a process that often resulted in the pirates receiving only a fraction of the goods' actual value. The spending patterns of pirates in port unveiled their psychological state and their expectations about the future. Men who had lived with constant danger and deprivation would indulge themselves in luxury and pleasure, purchasing expensive clothing, fine weapons, and the services of prostitutes. They would gamble recklessly, drink to excess, and partake in displays of conspicuous consumption that quickly depleted their resources. The gambling that consumed so much pirate wealth was often manipulated against them by professional swindlers and corrupt tavern proprietors. Card games, dice, and other forms of betting were designed to separate pirates from their money as swiftly as possible. Many pirates were illiterate and innumerate, rendering them easy targets for sophisticated scams and mathematical tricks that they couldn't comprehend or detect. The cost of sustaining a pirate lifestyle was enormous and often underestimated by those who chose this path. Ships required constant maintenance and repair. Weapons needed to be replaced or upgraded, and supplies had to be purchased at inflated prices from corrupt merchants. The crew had to be fed and provided with basic necessities, and the ship's officers expected to live in a style befitting their rank. These expenses consumed a large portion of any captured wealth before it could be distributed to the crew. The economic relationship between pirates and the ports that served them was exploitative on both sides. Merchants would charge exorbitant prices for goods and services, knowing that pirates had few alternatives and were often desperate for supplies. Pirates, in turn, would sometimes rob the very merchants they had just done business with, seeing them as legitimate targets for further plunder. This created a cycle of mutual exploitation and distrust that made long-term economic relationships impossible. The conversion of stolen goods into usable currency was a complex and perilous process that often resulted in significant losses for the pirates. Corrupt merchants would undervalue captured goods, claiming that they were damaged, of poor quality, or difficult to sell. Pirates, eager to convert their plunder into cash, would often accept these lowball offers rather than risk holding on to goods that might be recognized by their original owners or confiscated by authorities. The absence of banking or financial services in pirate ports meant that wealth had to be carried in physical form, making it vulnerable to theft, loss, or damage. Pirates would bury their treasure on remote islands, hide it in secret compartments aboard their ships, or simply carry it with them at all times. All of these methods were risky, and many pirates lost their life savings to thieves, accidents, or simple forgetfulness about where they had hidden their wealth. The psychological impact of sudden wealth followed by rapid poverty was devastating for many pirates. Men who had risked their lives to acquire a fortune would find themselves broke and desperate within weeks of their greatest success. This cycle of rapid wealth accumulation and subsequent dissipation fostered a gambling mindset among pirates, intensifying their recklessness in spending and their desperation in seeking new targets. The economic disparity within pirate crews served as a perpetual source of friction and discord. Although their articles might stipulate equal shares for common sailors, the reality was that officers, specialists, and those with personal ties to the captain often received preferential treatment. This inequity fueled resentment and frequently instigated mutinies or the formation of rival factions within the crew. The long-term financial prospects for pirates were consistently bleak. Unlike legitimate mariners who might eventually retire with some savings or a pension, pirates faced a future characterized by impoverishment, disability, or demise. The rigorous physical demands of a pirate's life meant that few individuals could sustain the profession beyond their 30s, and those who did survive often found themselves debilitated by injuries or illnesses that precluded other forms of employment. The economic repercussions of piracy on legitimate trade were substantial, prompting enhanced security measures that rendered pirate attacks more challenging and perilous. Merchant vessels began to travel in convoys, employ armed guards, and adopt other precautions that diminish the pirates' chances of success. These defensive strategies escalated the costs and risks associated with piracy, while simultaneously curtailing potential rewards. The relationship between pirates and the broader economy was parasitic rather than productive. Pirates generated no wealth independently. Instead, they merely redistributed existing wealth through acts of violence and theft. This redistribution was inefficient and destructive, as a significant portion of the stolen assets was squandered on consumption rather than being invested in productive endeavors. The economic drain inflicted by piracy was a contributing factor that ultimately led to its suppression by naval forces and colonial authorities. The financial records maintained by pirate crews, when they existed at all, were rudimentary and frequently inaccurate. Most pirates were illiterate and lacked any comprehension of accounting or financial management. This absence of proper record-keeping complicated the tracking of expenses, future planning, or the resolution of disputes concerning wealth distribution. The lack of financial discipline contributed to the swift depletion of pirate fortunes and the persistent poverty that defined most pirate careers. The wages of sin, as foretold by religious institutions, were indeed death. However, preceding that final reckoning came poverty, sickness, and the gradual erosion of any remaining humanity the pirates possessed. The wealth they had committed atrocities for would elude their grasp like sand, leaving them with nothing but memories of violence and the grim realization that they had bartered their souls for fleeting pleasures that had already dissolved into regret. As a pirate's notoriety grew, so too did the resolve of civilized nations to apprehend, try, and execute them. The romanticized notion of pirates as free spirits operating beyond the purview of law and order was a perilous delusion. In actuality, they were hunted prey with bounties on their heads, constantly scanning over their shoulders for the naval forces that were closing in with methodical precision. The shift in piracy's status from a tolerated nuisance to a primary target for eradication commenced in the early 18th century, as European powers recognized that the economic damage caused by pirate attacks was becoming unsustainable. The War of the Spanish Succession had concluded, leaving thousands of experienced naval officers and sailors unemployed and available for anti-piracy operations. Colonial governors were granted extensive powers to pursue pirates, and substantial rewards were offered for their capture or demise. The naval forces arrayed against them were professional, well-equipped, and utterly ruthless in their pursuit of pirates. Royal Navy frigates and sloops of war were swifter and more heavily armed than most pirate vessels, manned by disciplined crews specifically trained for combat against pirates. These ships carried seasoned officers who understood pirate tactics and were prepared to counter them with superior firepower and seamanship. The intelligence network supporting anti-piracy operations was remarkably sophisticated for its era. Colonial authorities maintained networks of informants in pirate ports, offering rewards for information regarding pirate movements and plans. Captured pirates were subjected to torture to reveal the locations of their bases and the identities of their accomplices. Merchants who had been robbed provided detailed descriptions of pirate ships and crews, creating a database of information that naval commanders could utilize to track their quarry. The legal framework for prosecuting pirates was streamlined to ensure rapid justice and maximum deterrent effect. Special admiralty courts were established in colonial ports with judges who possessed broad powers to try and sentence pirates without the lengthy procedures that might permit them to escape or be rescued by their comrades. The death penalty was mandatory for piracy, and executions were carried out swiftly and publicly to serve as warnings to others who might be tempted to follow the same path. The psychological warfare waged against pirates was as crucial as the physical pursuit. Captured pirates were frequently tortured to extract information, then executed in the most public and gruesome manner possible. Their bodies would be displayed in iron cages called gibbets, left to decompose as warnings to other potential pirates. The message was unequivocally clear. This was the destiny awaiting all who embraced the pirate's life. The economic pressure applied to pirate operations was systematic and effective. Legitimate merchants were encouraged to arm their vessels and travel in convoys, rendering them harder targets for pirate attacks. Ports that had previously welcomed pirates were blockaded or occupied by naval forces, severing the pirates' sources of supply and safe harbor. The corrupt merchants who had profited from dealings with pirates were arrested and prosecuted, disrupting the economic networks that had sustained pirate activities. A pirate's daily life as a hunted individual was dominated by paranoia and fear. Every sail on the horizon might belong to a naval vessel. Every port might conceal a trap. Every new crew member might be a spy or informant. Sleep became fitful and interrupted as they constantly listened for sounds that might signal an approaching enemy. The strain of incessant vigilance took its toll on physical and mental health, prematurely aging them and eroding any stability they had managed to maintain. The tactics employed by naval forces to hunt pirates were adapted from military operations against conventional adversaries, but modified to account for the pirates' superior knowledge of local waters and their willingness to resort to desperate measures to evade capture. Naval commanders would utilize multiple ships to encircle suspected pirate vessels, cutting off all escape routes. They would also employ local pilots who were familiar with the treacherous waters where pirates frequently sought refuge. The technology gap between naval forces and pirates was substantial and widening. Royal Navy ships were outfitted with the latest navigational instruments, superior cannons, and better-trained crews. Pirates, operating on limited budgets and lacking access to legitimate suppliers, were compelled to make do with captured or improvised equipment that was often inferior to what their pursuers possessed. The international cooperation in anti-piracy efforts was unprecedented for its time. European powers that were typically at war with each other would collaborate in hunting pirates, sharing intelligence, and coordinating operations. This cooperation made it impossible for pirates to pit different nations against each other, or to find safe haven by switching allegiances. The infiltration of pirate crews by naval agents posed a constant threat that added another layer of paranoia to an already stressful existence. These agents would join pirate crews as ordinary sailors, gathering intelligence about their operations and occasionally sabotaging their ships or weaponry at crucial moments. The discovery of a spy within the crew would lead to brutal torture and execution, but the damage would already have been inflicted. The gradual elimination of pirate safe havens was perhaps the most effective strategy employed by anti-piracy forces. One by one, the ports that had welcomed pirates were occupied, blockaded, or simply destroyed. Nassau, the most famous pirate stronghold, was occupied by a royal governor with a formidable naval force. Tortuga was abandoned as French authorities cracked down on pirate activities. Port Royal had already been largely devastated by an earthquake, and the survivors were driven out by British forces. The offer of pardons to pirates who surrendered was a clever psychological tactic that divided pirate crews and encouraged defections. These pardons were genuine, but came with conditions. The pardoned pirates had to provide information about their former comrades and sometimes actively participate in hunting them down. The knowledge that former shipmates might be collaborating with the authorities added another layer of mistrust and paranoia to pirate crews. The capture of prominent pirate leaders had a devastating effect on the morale and organization of pirate crews. When famed captains like Blackbeard, Black Bart Roberts, or Calico Jack were killed or captured, their crews often disbanded or were easily defeated by naval forces. The cult of personality that surrounded successful pirate captains meant that their loss could not be readily replaced. The trials and executions of captured pirates were carefully orchestrated public spectacles designed to demonstrate the power of legitimate authority and the futility of resistance. These occurrences received extensive coverage, with comprehensive accounts disseminated through newspapers and pamphlets that circulated throughout the maritime world. This message was further emphasized by displaying the bodies of executed pirates in prominent locations, visible to both sailors and potential future pirates. The relatives and associates of pirates were also targeted by authorities, intensifying pressure on those who might consider joining pirate crews. Wives and children of known pirates were frequently apprehended and interrogated, their possessions confiscated and their reputations ruined. This broadened scope of punishment, extending beyond the pirates themselves, significantly elevated the cost of piracy, making it a far more personal ordeal. The ultimate fate for most pirates was both predictable and grim. Those who avoided death in battle would inevitably be captured, tried, and executed. A small number might manage to escape to remote areas, living out their remaining days in poverty and obscurity. But the vast majority would meet violent ends, either at the hands of their adversaries or their own shipmates. The existence of a hunted pirate was characterized by brutality, short duration, and harshness, devoid of any prospect for peaceful retirement or a happy conclusion. The psychological toll of being perpetually pursued was perhaps the most cruel aspect of a pirate's destiny. The awareness that powerful entities were systematically striving to destroy them, that former companions might betray them for a reward, and that capture signified certain death, generated a level of stress that few individuals could long endure. Many pirates succumbed to this pressure, becoming paranoid, violent, or simply surrendering to their fate and awaiting the inevitable end. The human body was not designed to withstand the conditions aboard a pirate vessel. The cumulative physical strain that this lifestyle exacted was both immediate and prolonged. Disease became a constant companion, proving more lethal than any enemy's blade and more relentless than any naval pursuit. The confluence of inadequate nutrition, unsanitary environments, and incessant stress created an ideal breeding ground for every ailment known in the 18th century. Scurvy, perhaps the most dreaded disease among pirates, remained a mystery in terms of its cause to most sailors of that era. The absence of fresh fruits and vegetables in the pirate diet rendered vitamin C deficiency an inevitability on protracted voyages. The initial symptoms were deceptively mild: fatigue, joint pain, and minor bruises appearing without apparent cause. However, as the disease progressed, gums would begin to bleed and swell, teeth would loosen and fall out, and old wounds would reopen as the body's capacity for self-healing deteriorated. The advanced stages of scurvy presented a horrifying spectacle. Skin mottled with purplish spots, legs swollen with fluid, and the development of a distinctive foul breath that marked one as a victim of the disease. Many pirates would succumb to complications related to scurvy, their bodies simply giving way as connective tissues disintegrated and organs failed. Those who survived were often left permanently debilitated, toothless, and their bodies scarred by the disease's ravages. Dysentery posed another continuous threat aboard pirate ships, propagated by appalling sanitary conditions and contaminated water supplies. The disease would commence with stomach cramps and diarrhea, rapidly escalating to bloody stools, severe dehydration, and fever. In the confined spaces of a ship, dysentery would spread like wildfire through the crew, incapacitating men and creating a vicious cycle of deteriorating hygiene that exacerbated the outbreak. Treatment for dysentery was rudimentary and often counterproductive. Pirates would self-medicate with rum, convinced that alcohol would eliminate the disease-causing agents in their bodies. Some attempted to alleviate symptoms with opium or other drugs, but these remedies frequently worsened dehydration. The ship's surgeon, if available, might advocate bloodletting or purging, treatments that would further weaken patients already struggling for their lives. Typhus, transmitted by the lice that infested every pirate ship, was another sudden killer. The disease would manifest with a high fever, headache, and a distinct rash spreading across the victim's body. As the illness advanced, victims would become delirious, their bodies convulsing as their brains inflamed. The mortality rate for typhus was exceptionally high, and survivors often endured permanent neurological damage. Yellow fever, endemic in the Caribbean where many pirates operated, was perhaps the most feared disease of all. Symptoms would initially appear innocently enough: fever, headache, and muscle aches that might be mistaken for a common cold. But within days, victims would develop the characteristic yellow skin coloration that lent the disease its name, followed by black vomit as their organs began to fail. The mortality rate for yellow fever exceeded 50%, and no effective treatment was available. Malaria presented a constant danger in tropical waters, disseminated by mosquitoes breeding in the stagnant water found in every ship's bilge. The recurring fevers and chills of malaria would leave victims weakened and susceptible to other illnesses. Many pirates would suffer from chronic malaria for years, their health gradually deteriorating as the parasites in their blood proliferated and spread throughout their bodies. Sexually transmitted diseases were rampant among pirates, spread through contact with prostitutes in the lawless ports they frequented. Syphilis was particularly common and devastating, commencing with painless sores that would self-heal, leading victims to believe they had recovered. However, the disease would continue to progress, eventually attacking the heart, brain, and other organs. The final stages of syphilis were characterized by madness, paralysis, and death. Gonorrhea was another prevalent sexually transmitted disease that would cause painful urination, discharge, and eventually sterility in male victims. Available treatments were crude and often ineffective, involving mercury compounds that were inherently toxic, or painful procedures like inserting metal instruments into the urethra. Many pirates would endure chronic gonorrhea for years, the disease periodically flaring up and causing ongoing pain and disability. The dental health of pirates was universally deplorable, even by the standards of the era. The combination of poor nutrition, lack of dental care, and the continuous consumption of rum and tobacco created ideal conditions for tooth decay and gum disease. Most pirates would lose most or all of their teeth by their 30s, hindering eating and contributing to their overall poor health. The pain from infected teeth was constant and excruciating, with no effective treatment beyond extraction using crude tools. Respiratory illnesses were common aboard ships where men lived in close quarters and inhaled air thick with smoke, dust, and the exhalations of their sick shipmates. Tuberculosis was especially dreaded, as it would slowly consume its victims over months or years, causing them to waste away while coughing up blood. The disease was highly contagious, and once it appeared on a ship, it would often spread throughout the entire crew. Skin conditions were ubiquitous among pirates, caused by the combination of poor hygiene, constant moisture, and the various parasites that infested their bodies and clothing. Fungal infections would result in painful rashes and sores that would never fully heal in the damp conditions aboard ship. Bacterial infections would transform minor cuts and scrapes into festering wounds that could lead to blood poisoning and death. The psychological burden of constant illness was as devastating as the physical effects. Pirates would witness their shipmates wasting away from disease, knowing they might be next. The realization that no effective medical care was available, and that illness often meant a death sentence, fostered a fatalistic attitude that contributed to the reckless behavior characteristic of pirate life. The ship's surgeon, when one was available, was typically a man who had acquired his skills through practical experience rather than formal education. His medical kit would comprise a few rudimentary instruments: a bone saw for amputations, a set of forceps for extracting bullets or splinters, and a collection of bottles containing various medicines of questionable efficacy. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, with the patient restrained by his shipmates, while the surgeon worked by candlelight. The mortality rate aboard pirate ships was staggering, with disease claiming far more lives than combat ever did. It was not uncommon for a crew to lose half its members to illness during a single voyage, their bodies cast overboard to feed the sharks that trailed every pirate vessel. The survivors would be left weakened and demoralized, their numbers too few to effectively operate their ship or defend themselves against adversaries. The long-term health consequences of pirate life were universally bleak. Those who survived the immediate perils of disease and combat would often be left with chronic conditions that would plague them for the remainder of their lives. Former pirates could be identified by their missing teeth, scarred skin, and the distinctive shuffle of men whose joints had been damaged by years of arduous labor and poor nutrition. The irony of pirate life was that men who had embarked on this path in pursuit of freedom and wealth would find themselves enslaved by their own bodies, prisoners of diseases that would slowly kill them while they were still young. The treasure they had risked everything to acquire would be worthless to men too sick to enjoy it, and the freedom they had sought would be supplanted by the bondage of chronic illness and impending death. The psychological toll inflicted by a life of piracy often proved more destructive than any physical hardship. Persistent brutality, isolation, and moral decay gradually eroded any semblance of sanity and humanity one might have possessed. The ocean itself seemed to drive men to madness, its limitless expanse and hypnotic rhythms dismantling the mental fortifications that separated civilization from savagery. Many buccaneers succumbed to mental collapse long before physical demise, becoming mere husks of their former selves. The profound and maddening isolation of maritime life was inescapable. Encompassed by water in every direction, with no land in sight for weeks or months at a time, pirates began to feel alienated from the world they once knew. The boundless azure horizon played tricks on their minds, conjuring mirages and hallucinations that felt more tangible than the decaying deck beneath their feet. Crew members reported seeing non-existent islands, vessels that vanished upon approach, or the voices of loved ones carried on the waves. The unceasing threat of violence fostered a state of hypervigilance that was utterly draining. Pirates had to be perpetually ready for conflict, whether against external adversaries or their own shipmates. This continuous state of alertness gradually wore down their mental defenses, leaving them skittish, paranoid, and prone to explosive fits of aggression over minor issues. Sleep became restless and interrupted, as men would awaken at the slightest sound, their hands instinctively reaching for weapons always close at hand. The moral compromises essential for survival as a pirate gradually eroded any ethical framework that had previously guided their conduct. Men who had been raised to respect life, property, and human dignity found themselves committing acts of cruelty and violence that would have appalled their former selves. This moral disintegration was frequently accompanied by a sort of spiritual demise, as pirates abandoned their former religious convictions and embraced a nihilistic worldview that perceived life as meaningless and savage. The consumption of alcohol, a necessity for survival and a means of escaping the harsh realities of pirate life, frequently led to chronic alcoholism, further damaging already fragile mental states. Pirates drank to dull the pain of injuries, to obliterate memories of witnessed horrors, and to gather the courage to face another day of violence and uncertainty. Yet, alcohol also fueled their paranoia, amplified their tendency towards violence, and accelerated their mental deterioration. The superstitions that thrived aboard pirate vessels were both a symptom and a contributing factor to the crew's declining mental well-being. Men who had once been rational and skeptical began to perceive omens and portents in every unusual occurrence. A bird landing on the rigging might be interpreted as a harbinger of impending doom, while a shift in the wind could be seen as evidence of supernatural intervention. These superstitions often ignited violent clashes as crew members accused one another of attracting misfortune or angering the spirits of the sea. The nightmares that plagued pirates were vivid and recurrent, filled with images of the violence they had perpetrated and witnessed. Men would awaken screaming from dreams of burning ships, drowning victims, and the faces of those they had killed. These nocturnal terrors frequently bled into their waking hours, creating a constant state of psychological torment that blurred the line between reality and hallucination. The social dynamics aboard pirate ships were toxic and destructive, cultivating an environment where mental illness could proliferate unchecked. The relentless competition for status and resources, coupled with the understanding that any sign of weakness could prove fatal, created a pressure cooker of psychological stress. Men would turn on each other with savage intensity, their relationships poisoned by suspicion, jealousy, and the knowledge that their shipmates were capable of murder. The absence of privacy on board meant there was no escape from the surrounding madness. Pirates were compelled to witness the mental breakdowns of their shipmates, observing strong men reduced to incoherent wrecks by the pressures of their chosen existence. This constant exposure to mental illness often triggered similar breakdowns in other crew members, creating an epidemic of madness that could sweep through an entire ship. The physical manifestations of mental illness were often misidentified as other conditions, or simply overlooked as part of the typical hardships of pirate life. Men suffering from severe depression might be perceived as lazy or cowardly, while those experiencing psychotic episodes might be dismissed as intoxicated or possessed by evil spirits. The lack of understanding regarding mental health meant that pirates received no treatment for their psychological problems, allowing their conditions to worsen until they became completely dysfunctional. The violence inherent in pirate life frequently escalated beyond any rational purpose as mentally unstable crew members lashed out at perceived enemies or imagined threats. These outbursts of irrational aggression created a cycle of retaliation and revenge that could tear a crew apart. Men who had once been trusted shipmates became mortal enemies over trivial disputes, their judgment clouded by paranoia and mental illness. The religious delusions that occasionally afflicted pirates were particularly disturbing, as men who had abandoned conventional morality sometimes developed elaborate theological justifications for their crimes. Some came to believe they were instruments of divine justice, punishing the wicked and redistributing wealth according to God's will, Others became convinced they were damned souls, already deceased, serving their time in hell aboard their floating prison. The sexual frustration and isolation characteristic of life aboard pirate ships often manifested in unsettling ways, as men deprived of normal human relationships developed unhealthy obsessions or engaged in violent sexual behavior. The few women encountered during raids frequently became the focus of intense and dangerous fixations, leading to conflicts that could disrupt crew cohesion and result in multiple fatalities. The gradual loss of language and communication skills was another symptom of the psychological deterioration that affected long-term pirates. Men who had once been articulate and intelligent found themselves struggling to express complex thoughts or emotions. Their vocabulary reduced to the crude slang and profanity that dominated shipboard conversation. This linguistic degradation further isolated them from civilized society and made a return to normal life even more difficult. The paranoid delusions that afflicted many pirates often centered on their shipmates, as men became convinced that their comrades were conspiring against them or stealing their share of the plunder. These suspicions were sometimes justified, but more often they were the product of diseased minds that could no longer differentiate between real threats and imaginary ones. The ensuing conflicts frequently culminated in violence as paranoid pirates attacked first against perceived enemies. The complete breakdown of normal social inhibitions was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of pirate madness. Men who had once been capable of kindness, compassion, and love became capable of the most horrific cruelties without any apparent emotional response. They would torture prisoners for information they didn't need, kill victims who had already surrendered, and commit acts of violence that served no purpose beyond the gratification of their own twisted desires. The final stage of pirate madness was often a kind of catatonic withdrawal from reality. Men who could no longer cope with the horrors of their existence simply shut down mentally. These broken souls would sit staring at the horizon for hours, unresponsive to their surroundings and seemingly unaware of the chaos around them. They would continue to function mechanically, performing their duties without thought or emotion until death finally released them from their psychological prison. The madness of the sea was not merely a metaphor, but a literal description of what happened to men who spent too long in the unnatural environment of a pirate ship. Severed from the stabilizing influences of family, community, and moral structure, enveloped by violence and corruption, and subjected to constant stress and deprivation, even the strongest minds would eventually succumb to the pressure. The sea would claim not just their bodies, but their souls, leaving behind hollow husks that bore little resemblance to the men they had once been. The conclusion of a pirate's career was as brutal and inevitable as every other aspect of their chosen profession. Whether it arrived through violence, disease, or the long arm of justice, death was the only retirement plan available to those who had chosen to live by the sword. The final reckoning would arrive without warning, often when pirates least expected it, and it would be neither swift nor merciful. For most pirates, the end would come in battle, their bodies ripped apart by cannon fire or cutlass blades as they fought desperately against overwhelming odds. The romantic notion of dying gloriously in combat was a cruel deception. Most pirates would die screaming in agony, their entrails spilled across a blood-soaked deck while their shipmates stepped over their bodies to continue fighting. There was no honor in these deaths, no noble sacrifice for a worthy cause, just the brutal arithmetic of violence that claimed the weak, the unlucky, and the slow. The fortunate ones met their ends swiftly, their heads severed by a cannonball or their hearts pierced by a precisely aimed blade. Many, however, would suffer for hours or even days, their bodies broken yet their minds acutely aware, compelled to contemplate their approaching demise as their wounds festered and their vitality slowly dwindled. The ship's surgeon, if he remained alive, might attempt to alleviate their torment with rum or opium. Yet more often, the dying were abandoned to their fate, forsaken by shipmates engrossed in more immediate concerns than comforting the condemned. Those who survived battle might encounter an even grimmer destiny, capture by naval forces or colonial authorities determined to make examples of them. Trials for apprehended pirates were expeditious and predetermined, with judges uninterested in pleas for mercy or contextual explanations. The evidence was typically overwhelming. Pilfered goods discovered aboard their vessels, the testimonies of their victims, and their own confessions extracted through torture or the promise of a swift death. The executions following these trials were public spectacles, designed to exhibit the power of legitimate authority and the futility of defiance. Pirates were hanged in groups, their bodies left swaying in the wind as deterrents to others who might be tempted to emulate their lives. Crowds gathering to witness these executions frequently surpassed those attending religious services or civic celebrations, drawn by a morbid fascination with the violent conclusions of violent men. Some pirates would meet their end through the perfidy of their own shipmates, slain by men they had implicitly trusted. The bonds of camaraderie purportedly uniting pirate crews were delicate, easily shattered by avarice, envy, or the lure of a royal pardon. Former associates would turn on each other with brutal intensity, their intimate knowledge of each other's vulnerabilities rendering their betrayals all the more devastating. The diseases endemic aboard pirate ships claimed more lives than all battles and executions combined. Men wasted away from scurvy, dysentery, or tropical fevers, their bodies gradually consumed as their immune systems collapsed under the assault of malnutrition and unsanitary conditions. These deaths were often protracted and excruciating, with victims lingering for weeks or months as their strength progressively failed and their minds began to wander. The madness afflicting many long-term pirates occasionally led them to take their own lives, leaping overboard in moments of despair or desperation. These suicides were frequently impulsive acts committed by men no longer able to endure the psychological torment of their existence. Their bodies vanished beneath the waves without ceremony, their deaths noted only by the reduction in the ship's roster and the redistribution of their meager possessions among the survivors. The few pirates fortunate enough to evade the immediate perils of their profession often discovered that their past had indelibly marked them. Former pirates were distinguishable by their scars, missing limbs, and the distinctive mannerisms that identified them as men who had lived outside the law. They were ostracized by respectable society, unable to secure legitimate employment or forge normal relationships with law-abiding citizens. Those who attempted to retire from piracy learned there was no sanctuary for men with their history. Pardons offered by colonial governors were frequently conditional and temporary, subject to revocation if the former pirates were suspected of reverting to their old ways. Many were arrested years after abandoning piracy, their past transgressions catching up to them when least expected. The physical toll of pirate life continued to claim victims long after they had left the sea. Former pirates died prematurely from diseases they had contracted, injuries they had sustained, and the cumulative damage that years of arduous living had inflicted on their bodies. Their deaths were often solitary and unmourned, as they had severed all ties with family and community when they chose the pirate's path. The psychological damage inflicted by years of violence and moral corruption proved irremediable. Former pirates grappled with nightmares, paranoia, and violent impulses that hampered their ability to function in civilized society. Many resorted to alcohol or other substances to numb their pain, accelerating their physical decline and ensuring their deaths would be as wretched as their lives had become. The few pirates who managed to amass substantial wealth often found their riches to be valueless. Money could not restore their health, their sanity, or their place in respectable society. They died as outcasts, their treasure incapable of purchasing the one thing they truly desired: redemption for the crimes they had committed and the lives they had ruined. The families of pirates, when they existed, frequently suffered alongside their criminal relatives. Wives and children were ostracized by their communities, their reputations tarnished by association with piracy. Many changed their names and relocated to distant places, endeavoring to escape the stigma of their connection to men who had chosen to live outside the law. The historical record of individual pirates was often succinct and incomplete, as most died without leaving any lasting impact on the world beyond the suffering they had inflicted. Their names were forgotten, their stories relegated to cautionary tales told to frighten children or entertain tavern patrons. the vast majority of pirates faded into oblivion without anyone mourning their deaths or remembering their lives. The irony of the pirates' destiny was that men who had sought liberation from the constraints of civilized society found themselves ensnared in a prison of their own making. The choices they had made in pursuit of liberty and wealth ultimately led to bondage, destitution, and death. They had bartered their souls for fleeting pleasures and discovered that the bargain was not worth the price they had paid. The final reckoning for pirates was not merely individual but collective. The entire pirate community that had flourished in the Caribbean during the early 18th century was systematically eradicated by the combined efforts of European naval forces and colonial authorities. Ports that had welcomed pirates were occupied or destroyed. Merchants who had traded with them were arrested or driven out of business, and the networks that had sustained pirate operations were dismantled piece by piece. The end of the golden age of piracy was as violent and turbulent as the era itself. The last great pirate captains perished in battle or on the gallows, their crews dispersed to the winds or completely annihilated. The ships that had once terrorized merchant vessels were captured and converted to legitimate uses, their black flags supplanted by the colors of respectable nations. The treasure accumulated through years of violence and theft was confiscated by authorities or lost forever in the ocean's depths. The legacy of piracy endured in stories and legends. Still, the reality of pirate life, the disease, the violence, the moral corruption, and the inescapable doom awaiting all who chose this path, was forgotten or romanticized beyond recognition. The brutal truth about the pirate's existence was interred beneath layers of myth and fantasy, leaving future generations with a distorted perception of what it truly meant to live and die as an enemy of all humankind. The final reckoning had arrived, and it was as merciless as the men who had lived by violence and died by it. The era of piracy was concluding, not with a glorious last stand, but with a whimper, as the last survivors of a brutal age were hunted down and eliminated like the vermin they had always been. The sea, once their avenue to freedom, had become their graveyard, and the black flag that had once instilled terror in the hearts of honest sailors would fly no more. And so concludes our exploration of the harsh existence of a pirate. From the moment a desperate individual first stepped aboard a pirate vessel to the inevitable day death claimed him, we have observed how the romantic myths of piracy crumble under the weight of historical reality. These were not dashing heroes living lives of adventure and freedom. They were broken men trapped in a cycle of violence, disease, and moral decay that consumed everything it touched. The pirates of the Golden Age lived brief, brutal lives marked by constant suffering and the awareness that their choices had severed them from everything that makes life worthwhile. They exchanged their humanity for temporary wealth and discovered that the bargain left them poorer than the honest sailors they had once been. Their ships were floating hells, their ports were cesspools of corruption, and their brotherhood was founded on mutual fear rather than genuine loyalty. The diseases that ravaged their bodies were paralleled by the madness that consumed their minds, as years of violence and isolation stripped away whatever sanity and decency they had once possessed. They died as they had lived, violently, miserably, and largely unmourned by a world that was better off without them. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, perhaps spare a thought for these forgotten souls who chose the wrong path and paid the ultimate price for their mistakes. Their story serves as a reminder that freedom without responsibility is merely another form of enslavement, and that those who live by the sword will inevitably perish by it. The harsh existence of a pirate was undoubtedly savage, yet it was also short-lived, and within that brevity perhaps resided the singular compassion these individuals would ever encounter. Their suffering was immense, but it was not protracted. And when mortality ultimately took hold, it frequently served as an escape from a life that had grown intolerable. May they rest in peace, and recall that the romanticized buccaneer of lore was a mere fabrication. The authentic pirates were architects of their own monstrosity, and their destiny was precisely what they merited.